This is Marc Kramer. I'm a senior lecturer at Vin University teaching entrepreneurship. I'm also the host of Asian Founders and Funders. Today, our guest is Dr. Ramesh Ramachandra, who is the author of The Big Jump into Entrepreneurship, and she is also the founder CEO of talent leadership Crucible. Dr. Ramesh, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. Let's start off with you talking a little bit about your professional experience and your consulting practice.
Talent Leadership Crucible is a company which specializes in corporate culture change work. We start off by creating for people a new view of themselves as well as what they're up to. And then it allows us to create a vision for the company and for them to all align to that as a shared common future. And we find that this allows companies to transform their corporate culture as well as to improve their performance of their teams as well as the company itself.
So before we get into the book, I'm just curious about this. Because of the pandemic, we have hastened going into remote and distance work. And I'm wondering, how does that affect corporate culture today? Because now a lot of people just still want to be staying at home and working from home as going into an office. And I'm from Philadelphia, and one of the major law firms has reduced their space from 100,000 square feet to 10,000 square feet. And they're now doing something called a hoteling, where people come in like twice, no more than 3 times a week, and they don't even have an office. They just are put into an office. So how is that affecting corporate culture?
I think that's a great question, because this particular shift in people's desire to work from home and have flexibility also matches with the shift that we have seen, whereby people want to do meaningful or purposeful work. And about 10 years ago, when I started this company, we invested in actually spending time for people to get to know what their own purpose was as an individual. And we find that when someone is connected to their individual purpose, it's easier for them to then align to the company's purpose or vision. If you have a team of people who are going to be working remotely, I think it's going to be important for them to get a sense of who they are, and then have that be linked to who the company is, and then keep different structures in place so that you can stay connected with each other, even though you may not be seeing each other physically all the time.
Now let's talk about your book. Well, why did you write this book?
It was 2003, and I just finished 2 years of training people day after day on how to start and run a business in Singapore and the region. Singapore government had in end of 1999 started to look at making entrepreneurship a mainstream activity. There was a lot of baggage around someone being an entrepreneur then, because a businessman in those days was considered someone who had not made it, past maybe O levels. And they were also considered to be people who were not honest, maybe, right? There was this whole baggage of who an entrepreneur was. And at the same time, we could see that for the economy to grow, for people to progress, there was a need for more people to actually start their own businesses and get onto the entrepreneurship bandwagon. So I designed a 2-day program on how to start and run a business. And most of it was based on really the challenge that we had internally in terms of our mindset on why we did not want to become entrepreneurs. And at the end of the program, a third of the people would have actually done up a business plan and were like ready to start. A third of them would say, well, I want to become an entrepreneur, but I want to wait till, I pay off my loans or my kids grow up. And a third were like, no, never. But what I was heartened by was that at least I was able to create for people the excitement that entrepreneurship can be a mindset as much as starting and running a business. So those who did the program saw that they could go back and continue being a civil servant or a corporate employee and use these valuable ways of thinking as an entrepreneur in their jobs as well. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this for the rest of my life. Let me just write up a book, and I published the book.
But you now updated the book. So talk about the new book.
It was during COVID pandemic times. And I was like, do I want to update the book? Because it seems like doing stuff online had gained traction. So I sat down to look at what needed to be changed. And it was amazing because the core of entrepreneurship really had not changed, which is essentially I use someone who is resourceful, which means that you can look at a problem and you can define it accurately. And that helps you to solve it. Number two is that you're someone who has a high appetite towards taking risk as well as being able to manage uncertainty. And lastly, of course, you want to create value, not just for yourself, but also for others in financial and non financial terms. So when I looked at that as the definition of entrepreneurship, I saw that that had not changed. What had changed perhaps was that a lot more businesses were online. And so there were other kinds of businesses. Interestingly enough, like I shared with you at the dinner the other day, bubble tea made its comeback when in 2003 we had a crash and burn because a lot of people had gotten into bubble tea. But the bubble tea has now come back in terms of a consolidated wave because you have these large chains like Liho, Gongcha, bubble tea shops with one brand, with the small mom and pop shops.
Let's talk about why do people become entrepreneurs? And entrepreneurs, since the time you originally wrote the book till now, have become rock stars all over the world, and especially in Singapore, where they've had many successful unicorn companies.
It's interesting. In Singapore, I think why people become entrepreneurs has not really changed. It's been somewhat driven by the opportunity that they see in front of them. Mostly for them, either it is an access to a technology or to a network or to funds. But in other developing countries, you will find that a lot of people become entrepreneurs because it is a need, like they can't find a job and they need to feed their family. And so there is a deeper hunger to their entrepreneurship because it is for survival. So you have two spectrums of why someone could get into entrepreneurship.
Do you define entrepreneurship differently? Like my grandfather owned a corner store across from a steel mill, and it was a luncheonette, magazines, a bunch of different things, like almost like a general store. And my father owned a medical equipment business, but I thought of them as shopkeepers, not entrepreneurs, because they didn't expand beyond the current location. Do you define entrepreneurship differently than someone being just being a business person slash shopkeeper?
There's a lot of debate about that, whether someone who is not expanding or growing is a true entrepreneur. But I think you can have a range of entrepreneurial activities. And it's okay, if you hit the lowest bar or you go to the highest extent where you have a biotech company and you're innovating with technology and you bring entrepreneurship into that area. My definition is a lot looser.
Go ahead with your definition.
So my definition is that so long as you start a business and you take the risk, you manage the uncertainty and you create value for yourself, which can be financial or non-financial, then, you're being an entrepreneur.
I think though, everybody, when you say financial or non-financial, are you talking about people who start things in the nonprofit sector and build great organizations that make a difference in society when you say that?
Yes, absolutely. You see a lot of that happening today where people want to pursue their passion and they want to serve a group who's underserved. And that is entrepreneurship too, because what they're doing is that they're taking those skills of entrepreneurship, which is to spot and seize an opportunity, to evaluate and analyze, and then to create a business around that so that it's sustainable. So you can do that in the social services sector. You can do that in the not-for-profit sector. You can do that in a commercial way, and you can do that in a high-tech way as well.
So what skills does it take to be a successful entrepreneur?
An entrepreneur is, number one, resourceful. And so you're dealing with whatever that shows up in front of you as a problem, because today you might not have that customer that you expected and you have to pay salaries. And so what are you going to do about that? Are you going to give up, or are you going to close a sale, or how are you going to deal with that crisis? And then on the other side, that you have startups who are looking to raise funds. And in today's marketplace, it's really difficult. So are you going to sit back and say, okay, unless I fundraise, I'm not going to continue expanding? Or are you going to continue to bootstrap up and get your product into the market? These two extremes show you that as an entrepreneur, you're out there trying to solve this, not because someone told you to, but because you own it and you know that that's important. Number two is that you're also taking risks at every point, because at times you might be married and you might be having a family and all of your commitments. And you have to make a trade off between, do I put in more money into the business when I've also got expenses for the household? And how do you actually manage that? And that's a real issue for them. Or sometimes it's not about money, it's about time. Are you able to spend quality time with your family when you're spending 18 hours a day at work in building out your company? Lastly, this whole thing about value is really very hard to define, because some people are motivated by money. Some people are motivated by success in a very tangible way, in terms of, I want to buy this car, or I want to get this house. But there are others who see that value can be created by touching other people's lives. And it can be a lot more harder to measure. But for them, it's very clear that if they impacted 100 families or 1,000 farmers, that's creating value. So it doesn't matter what it is. Ultimately, entrepreneurship is about getting the freedom to pursue a life that you create by yourself. You define the boundaries of how you operate and what success is for you. And I think the gig economy at some level is sort of pushing people to explore that aspect of aspiration, where we truly can do what we want to do in our lives, find meaning and make a living and be fulfilled.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question later about that. So we're going to put that on hold for a second.
Okay.
What mental skills do entrepreneurs need to succeed?
It all depends on the kind of business that you're going to start. So apart from someone who's a go-getter and who shows initiative and has the discipline and the resourcefulness, I think when you look at the technical skills or the competencies, then you come down to, can you do your financial forecast? Are you able to assess the opportunity? And are you able to promote yourself or market your product or to sell? I personally feel that you can get people who can complement you, so you don't have to be stuck, like you have to know everything. And also the attraction of a lot of these platform businesses, a lot of these things are already done for you. And so as an entrepreneur who is running an online store, maybe all you have to do is to have the characteristics of being someone who's disciplined and resilient and whatever, rather than I have to go out there and build this platform to sell online.
Why do entrepreneurs typically fail based on your now over 20 years or more experience? What have you observed? Why do they typically fail?
The number one reason is actually managing cash flow and underestimating what is required to manage that. So a good example would be, when you start a business, you have enough buffer for working capital. And if you don't, then are you actually selling so that you're bringing in the revenue? And if you're not selling, then have you raised sufficient capital to keep the business running? So that's one piece. The second piece is, how do you actually deal with failure? Because when you do your plan of how you're going to set up your company, things don't go according to plan. And so what are you going to do about that? A lot of people are unable to deal with those setbacks, and so they give up as well. So these would be the two big reasons.
In your book, you say now it's time to start a company. Now that was 2003. Now the updated version. Do you think it's still time to start a company? And what makes you say that?
Yeah, it is so appropriate. You'd ask me this question about work from home
Yes.
phenomena. And what's going to happen is that big companies are going to have teams of people leave the organization and stop being employees. But what these people are going to become is freelancers who will band together into 2, 3 man shows. And that's going to become a company. And then they will provide the service to this large organization that they used to work for, and eventually maybe 2 or 3 others. And so that's one phenomena that's going to happen, where the freelancers are going to organize themselves into smaller companies. And some people might not even organize themselves into a company, but they may still look at themselves as entrepreneurs. That's why the definition of entrepreneurship is going to be broader than that narrow definition of someone who's creating value and expanding the business beyond just having one store.
Isn't it amazing? Like 300 years ago, the vast majority of people were entrepreneurs. You know, you're a blacksmith, you're a shopkeeper of some type. You didn't work for a manufacturing company 300 years ago. And then over time, manufacturing came into vogue and entrepreneurs were always existed. And to a large degree, were the majority of businesses. But most people wanted to work for large companies. And now it's reverted back to where people rather control their own professional and financial future by having their own full-time or part-time gig. Do you recommend aspiring entrepreneurs to keep their day job until they can prove their idea can replace their existing revenue stream, existing income?
Absolutely. And I think that was very relevant 20 years ago, because if I didn't do that, no one was going to finance my expenses. But then I look at my daughter's generation, and she's in her late 20s, and she has the luxury of a mother or a father who can provide her with the basic whatever that she needs. So I think for the younger generation, they are quite comfortable about quitting their day job because they don't have those commitments or the fear of not being able to survive.
Now, my own daughter said that she would never become an entrepreneur because I typically work a 6-day week. I mean, I coached them. We went on vacations. We did everything, but I worked a lot of hours. And so she could not, she had met someone and married someone from Sweden, moved to Sweden, couldn't get jobs. So I said, honey, why don't we start you with a marketing practice? I'll do it, but I'm just doing it so until I find a full-time job. Well, now she has a global communications business with some of the best clients in the world. And all because she went out on her own, and now she would not trade it for anything to be on her own. And she's able to spend, she lives in Los Angeles now, and she's able to spend a month in Sweden. She's able to spend a month in Philadelphia, where she's originally from, a month in Florida to visit her mom. So she's able to go wherever she wants, and her clients don't really care as long as she gets the work done, and she's got, people work with her from around the world. So I think this generation sees at entrepreneurship at first, worried about quality of life, but then they realize it's up to them about how big or small they want to grow their business, and they have all the flexibility in the world, and no one can fire them except for themselves, right? You mentioned the book that people are risk adverse. Well, why is that?
Well, in Singapore at that time, the focus is on you getting a great job post your qualification, where you basically have a iron rice bowl. And for the people who joined the civil service, that was exactly it. And for those who joined the corporate MNCs, that also was similar. But in the recent 10 to 15 years, we've seen a lot of job retrenchment. And so that certainty around having a well-paid job isn't necessarily there. So then the question is, are we still going to be stuck with that old mindset that we don't want to take a risk? But I think that whole risk averse thing was more a cultural context, which was superimposed with people's fear of not having enough or they would lose something. But today, in the last 20 years, we've seen enough entrepreneurs fail. And a lot of their stories have been published openly. And we know that they don't die. They survive. Some of them resurrect themselves and come back and make it big the second time round. I mean, Second Chance, if you know, is a great example of an entrepreneur who named his business Second Chance and really made it big.
Resiliency is an incredible important part of being an entrepreneur because of the high failure rate and your ability to dust yourself and get off the ground. Tom Monahan, who had started Domino's Pizza, which is a global chain, had over 20 failed pizzerias before he struck gold with Domino's. And Milton Hershey, I had actually interviewed his cousins, and his cousins said they thought they'd be taking care of him the rest of his life, they were all farmers. He was a failed farmer. He was a failed shopkeeper, and they thought they'd be taking care of him. And they said, who would have guessed that he would have come up with a formula for chocolate and create a successful candy business in Philadelphia that moved to Hershey, the town now called Hershey, Pennsylvania, that he created. So people might think after one failure that that's it for them. But if they've got the mental toughness to dust themselves off, I mean, I've done over 28 startups and had many failures, things I never thought would fail, and they had. You just have to forget about the failures. It's like a basketball player that just, if you miss 5 shots in a row, you can't worry about those 5 shots. You have to worry about making the next one. How do you pick the right service providers like law firms, accounting, business coaches? What do you recommend to entrepreneurs when they're making these selections?
It's a tough one. When I look back in my own journey, I mean, the first accountant that I had is still my accountant after 30 years, although I've gone through several different companies and he's represented me. So I think it's about asking your network to refer somebody and seeing whether your values are aligned, because that's important, because you want these resources to support you in your journey. And once you know that you've clicked, then just make sure that you create a long-term relationship with your professionals, because they understand you and they know your journey.
I agree with that. What industries do you think entrepreneurs should focus on in 2024?
Everyone talks about AI and all the other stuff, but personally, if you come from a country like Vietnam, there's so much of opportunity for different things, from a dry cleaner to a restaurant. So it doesn't matter. You've got to spend the time to assess what do you think is the need. I mean, I find that when I go out, I'm constantly looking at things. Like if I go to a restaurant which is bustling, I'm like counting, okay, how many tables do they have? And how many minutes did people spend on average? And how much must this guy be making? And then I discover, oh, he's got 3 other shops. So you've got to be open, you've got to be curious. And when you look out here in life, then that opportunity will show up. And I think that everyone has to do that thinking. So I'm sorry, but there is no tip here about what you should be doing in 2024, because you want to find something that's going to inspire you, especially on the days that things don't go right.
Should an entrepreneur find a mentor early in the process to help coach them and be a sounding board for their ideas?
I think that's important, but sometimes you may not find a person early in your journey, and that's okay too. If you have other people in your life who can be a sounding board to you, and sometimes in a closely knit family, it can be family members or it can be your friends. For other people, it can be even a role model that you don't even interact with. It could be like listening to your podcast of other entrepreneurs' journey. And I run a podcast as well called Thriving in the Age of Disruption. And the idea is that if you listen to enough people about their journey, you will get a sense of what you need to do, and that will guide you as well.
Here's my last question for you, and thanks so much for taking the time today. What is the state of Asian entrepreneurship, and what do you think the future is for entrepreneurship in Asia?
I think it's an exciting place to be an entrepreneur in Asia. The hub of all activities here. The population is young, it's dynamic, it's hungry. And people are ready for the challenge. I'm sure you have observed that in Vietnam itself. It's a lot more entrepreneurial than Singapore. It's going to be an exciting 10 to 20 years here.
Well, I mean, certainly this is kind of a follow up to it that in Vietnam, I see an enormous number of women entrepreneurs and really smart, capable entrepreneurs. And I don't hear women, as they say, or still kind of say in the US about a glass ceiling. I see a large amount of support for women entrepreneurs here, and they're incredibly sophisticated.
That's so true. It's a great observation. Women here are empowered to really be in the business world, and they do a great job with that.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. And we look forward to maybe having you back again to talk about your latest book. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me and having this conversation.